I was brought up in a Christian home where going to church regularly, reading the Bible and praying were all normal parts of life. Consistently as an adult myself, I've lived as a Christian, so I've listened to a large number of sermons over the years and spent many hours reading the Bible, both individually and also together with other people. But at no time have I ever undertaken formal theological training, so I have no formal qualifications in theology, not even at school level. The closest I get to this is a GCSE equivalent in ancient Greek, which is about 200 years or so before Biblical Greek. I'm not able to read the New Testament in the original language and can only really recognise a few words, and I've never studied Biblical Hebrew. And in terms of understanding the Bible, it really does seem to me that this matters. Now, let me give two examples from the life of Gideon, but before we go any further, I'd like to thank my dad, Cyril Tennant, for his help in preparing this talk. Dad can indeed read the Bible in the original Hebrew and Greek. Really grateful to be able to call upon his expertise, both of the languages and also the underlying cultures. So let me give you two examples where my lack of understanding, in this case of the Hebrew, really does seem to matter. In Judges chapter 8 verse 31, we're told that Gideon called his son Abimelech. Now, to the modern reader engaging with an English translation, this doesn't really mean anything. But to the original reader in Hebrew, Gideon calling his son Abimelech would have sounded major alarm bells. Why? Well, because Abimelech means father of the king. So in calling his son Abimelech, Gideon was positioning his family as royalty. But Gideon was a judge. He was not a king. At the time that he was a judge, Israel was a theocracy, and so God was the king. Judges in general did not hand on power to their sons, and as becomes apparent sometime later in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when the Israelites appealed for a king, giving rise firstly to King Saul and then to King David, there is the expectation that judges lived a much more modest lifestyle than kings. So now a number of other aspects of the Gideon story fall into place. Gideon had 70 sons from many wives and took plunder from the people, acts much more associated with contemporary kings than with judges. After Gideon's death, Abimelech killed his brothers and was indeed crowned king, reigning as such briefly before himself being killed, and the rule of the judges continued until somewhat later with King Saul. So what would have been clear to the original reader in Hebrew is lost when reading the text in English translation. Not only is the name Abimelech not familiar to an English speaker, there is no expectation that names should have meaning, but in Hebrew culture that was very much the expectation. So, for example, in Exodus 3:13, we read that Moses, as God was calling him to rescue the Israelites from Egypt, asked God what Moses's response should be if people asked him, "What is God's name?" Which reads slightly oddly in English. Again, in Hebrew the intent here would have been clear. In asking God what name Moses should say had been revealed, Moses is asking God to reveal a fresh insight into his character. In Hebrew culture, names matter and are expected to have meaning. Now, I've already said that I don't understand biblical Hebrew, so how is it that I know all of this? Well, the prosaic truth here is that I read it in a commentary on the Bible, specifically the New International Version Application Commentary, which means that I can gain insights from scholars who have indeed studied the Bible in the original language over long periods of time. I would say that the world is awash with study aids to the Bible. Many commentaries work verse by verse, which is great for serious study, maybe in preparing to speak, but not so good in my experience for day-to-day Bible study alongside a full-time job. The New International Version Application Commentary takes a much more discursive approach, looking at passages as a whole rather than verse by verse. It's worked really well for me for some years. It may not be the thing for you, but I would recommend the use of Bible study aids in accessing meaning. forgive me, in accessing meaning which is not immediately apparent in reading in English. Need to be slightly careful here. It may not be immediately obvious that authors are taking a particular stance in their interpretation. It's not a bad idea to take advice before committing to a particular author or particular series. There are other ways of accessing meaning without speaking the original languages, which I'll come to in a moment. Firstly, I want to move on to my second example, again from the life of Gideon. Perhaps the thing Gideon is best known for is the laying of the fleece and asking God to give a sign that it was right to go into battle with a much smaller army than would be normal. So the sign was, firstly, there being dew on the fleece with the ground dry, and then when that was granted, Gideon then asked for the sign to be the opposite way round. Now, in my experience, it tends to be assumed, not least because God honoured Gideon's request, that Gideon was right to ask for these signs. But I'm of the view that, in fact, Gideon was not right to ask for these signs. I'm happy to share my entire reasoning on request. But part of my reasoning, coming to this conclusion that Gideon was not right to ask for the signs, is what Gideon himself says as he's making the request, as recorded in Judges 6:36. If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised. Even as he is making his request, Gideon is clear that God has already spoken. And so asking for additional evidence is time wasting and showing an inappropriate level of doubt in what God has already said. But again, I'm reading the Bible in English. I'm sure you would agree with me that this kind of argument, depending on the exact form of words used, is somewhat precarious when working in translation. So what can I do to explore this idea further? Well, commentaries, of course, will help here. Then there are two other things I can do. If you type in Interlinear Hebrew Bible Judges into Google, then you will find a Bible Hub website which enables you to see the original Hebrew with a literal word-for-word translation underneath. It then becomes apparent that in Judges 6:36, that in fact Gideon had actually says the key phrase, as you have said, not once but twice in quick succession. Although I'm reliably informed that this kind of repetition is rather more normal in Hebrew than in English. You can also find online interlinear Greek Bibles to get a sense of exactly what the words are used, and this can be very valuable, although of course no substitute for being immersed in a language and all its nuances. Another thing we can do, which is very useful, is use the Bible Gateway website to see the same verse in over 50 different English translations, all on the screen, all at the same time. Interestingly, only one version, the Expanded Bible, explains what Abimelech means, although it's possible that it is in the footnotes of other translations. Also, curiously, the Expanded Bible actually gets this wrong and says that Abimelech means my father is king, rather than I am the father of the king. However, the underlying point that Gideon was positioning his family as royalty is the same. For Judges 6:36, with Gideon speaking, asking for a sign, the phrase, as you have said, is present in most of these translations, with the contemporary English version strengthening this and translating the verse, I know that you have promised to help me rescue Israel, but I need proof. So the way that all of these English languages are consistent with a phrase, as you have said, or as you have promised, or equivalent, this would appear to be evidence that what Gideon said can be taken as a reason to believe that he was wrong to ask for the sign, but this is not definitive, of course. There's a perfectly legitimate position that says that Gideon was right to ask. Now, as a teacher in a Christian school, I say whenever I get the opportunity to students that if they go on to theological training with Hebrew and Greek as options, please, please, please take those options. Being able to study the Bible in the original languages is a fantastic blessing and a great investment of time in being as effective in the Lord's service as possible. I'd love to be able to give the time to doing this myself. In the meantime, Commentaries, interlinear Bibles, and comparisons of different English versions at least give some sense of the meaning of the text beyond simply reading it in one translation. Thank you for listening to this video. I'll be really interested to hear from you, particularly if you have other thoughts on accessing the Bible without knowing Hebrew or Greek.